Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I was asked to speak about today was animal welfare because this is the module on animal welfare. So I will talk about animal welfare. In a nutshell, I think animal welfare is not only not useful, I think it's counterproductive. That has been a topic in my work for many years now. As a matter of fact, going back to the 1990s. And what I'd like to do, by the way, Evangelos, how long is this session? I mean, I'm happy to go as long as you want, but
Dear Gary, feel free to go as long as you wish. I mean, there's no time limits. I actually have a time limit, 2 hours, but I guess you'll be a little bit shorter than this, or not.
I've been a vegan for almost 40 years. I have endless energy, Evangelos.
Okay, okay.
Um,
So
okay,
no restrictions, no restrictions for you.
all right, very good. Um, so what I want to talk about a little bit about is animal welfare. Animal welfare is our sort of represents our conventional wisdom, the way we think about animals. It's been around now for a couple of hundred years because if you remember, or if you, I'm sure you know this, but so I won't dwell on this for a while, a long time. But up until the 19th century, basically, animals were excluded from the moral and legal community. I mean, there were some people who thought that they had moral value, but by and large, the overwhelming moral sentiment and certainly the legal system did not accommodate animals as having any sort of value. They were things. They were property, and they had no moral value. This changed in the 19th century, first in England, and then basically the rest, much of the world, certainly the Western world. And that was we shifted to this. We had this paradigm shift that animals could suffer, a recognition that animals could suffer, and that we could no longer ignore their interest in not suffering, but we could continue to use them. See, this was the interesting thing, was that um, I divide the moral universe into persons and things. Persons have moral value. They are beings who should not be treated exclusively as means to ends. And then there are things which have no intrinsic or inherent value and only have the value that we accord to them. And animals up until the 19th century were regarded as things. They did not have any moral value, and they certainly didn't have any interests that were protected by law, not in any significant way. And this changed in the 19th century because it was a recognition that because these beings could suffer, they had moral value, but they weren't persons. They weren't things. The 19th century, we got away from the idea that animals were just things that had no moral value, but they weren't persons either because we could continue to use and kill them. We could continue to use and kill them. And the interest that they had was in not suffering, not in continuing to live. Okay. Bentham was quite clear about this, as was everybody else, basically, that animals had an interest in not suffering because they could suffer. But because they were not cognitively like us, they did not have, they weren't able they weren't self-aware. They didn't have a sense of their future. They weren't connected to a future self. So they had no interest in continuing to live. They didn't care that we killed and used them. They only cared about how we treated them and how we killed them. And that killing them for food, causing them to suffer for food was really not different from, or for any other purpose, was not different from imposing suffering on them for any other purpose. They had an interest in not suffering. They didn't care whether they were being made to suffer for some reason other than death, than killing them, or for some other reason. They were indifferent to that. So they weren't persons. They weren't connected to a future self. They did not have any sense of the future. And so that they weren't persons, but they weren't things either. And so what happened was in the 19th century, we developed this idea that they were what I call in several of my books, quasi-persons, that they were quasi-persons. That they weren't things, but they weren't persons either because we could continue to use and to kill them. By the way, I'm a New Yorker. I speak fast. Can you understand? Am I speaking correctly? Okay. All right. All right. I try, but anyway. All right. I'll try to slow it down. All right. So they were regarded as quasi persons. Our moral obligation was to treat them humanely and to not impose any unnecessary suffering on them. What's really interesting is I'm not a historian of ideas, but my guess is there are very few instances in the history of ideas where there was such a dramatic paradigm shift over such a short period of time. We go into the 19th century basically with most of us thinking that animals are things, they just don't matter. We come out of the 19th century with basically laws in place in Britain and then the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, in terms of that protected animal interests in not suffering and in being treated humanely and not being subjected to unnecessary suffering. Now, it's important to understand that these laws are, for the most part, criminal laws. Anti-cruelty laws are, for the most part, I mean, there are different sorts of laws. You can have general laws and you can have specific laws. For the most part, anti-cruelty laws are criminal laws. Criminal law, the criminal code, contains those norms that are, or it's supposed to contain those norms that are ubiquitously accepted by society. Because if your criminal law has got a lot of rules in it that people think are nonsense, then people will not respect the criminal law. So the fact that we have anti-cruelty laws and they're in the criminal law suggests that we take this very seriously. We take the interests of animals very seriously, and we think that it's really wrong to impose suffering on them for no good reason, unnecessary suffering, that we have an obligation to treat them humanely. So we go into the 19th century with animals being things. We come out of the 19th century with a wholly different view of how we think about animals, that animals basically have an interest that we think is morally important, so morally important, we include it in the criminal law. And now we've got, now most places in the world have have anti-cruelty laws of one sort or another. And many nations have, for example, we have in the United States, we have, I'm sorry, I'm getting some interference. Okay, good stuff. In the United States, every state has a criminal law, but there are also laws that deal with, for example, there are laws at the national level that deal with the use of animals in experiments. There are laws at the national level that deal with the exhibition of animals in, zoos and places like that. And so there are specific laws that apply this humane idea to specific contexts, but then there are these general anti-cruelty laws. And so if you look at it from an abstract point of view, you would think, wow, we really take animal interests seriously. And the animal welfare idea that most of us accept. I mean, how many people do you know, have you met, who would disagree with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals and that we have a moral obligation that we owe directly to animals to treat them humanely and to not inflict unnecessary suffering on them? I mean, I remember once, many years ago, I stood outside the law school with some of my students at lunchtime for about 2 hours. And everybody who walked by the school, we asked, do you agree with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals and that we have a moral obligation to treat animals humanely? And with the few exceptions of the people who basically refused to answer the question because they thought they were going to get mugged or something. I don't know. They were worried or something about something. But the overwhelming number of people said, of course. What a stupid question. Of course it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Of course it's wrong to not treat animals humanely. So I think it's pretty ubiquitous. I don't think it's controversial. I mean, and if you don't believe me, ask some of your friends, do you think it's wrong? Do you think it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals? Most people will think you're very odd for asking that question. And so I think it's, it's not really controversial. It's our conventional wisdom. Okay. We have these laws. We think, we think that they work. We think that they may not be as good as they should be. We should make them better. But by and large, it's really good. We've got these, we take animal interests seriously. So we've got all these laws we have this animal welfare ethic. I think it's not only useless, I think it's counterproductive. So let me be clear about that. Useless and counterproductive. Now, I realize that I am an outlier in this area in the sense that most of the animal organizations promote some form of humane treatment or happy exploitation, as I call it. And I understand why they do that. They do that because it's a very effective fundraising technique, particularly if you want to keep your donor base very broad. You don't want to alienate potential donors. That's not something you want to do if you're running a not-for-profit organization. So what you want to do is you want to say, well, we're going to promote better treatment of animals, and we want you to fund us. We're going to have these campaigns for more humane treatment of animals, but we're going to, and we would like you to contribute to these campaigns. But by and large, in my judgment, these efforts are worthless, and I'll tell you why. Because animals are property. They are property. They are chattel property. They only have the value we give them. I have 5 dogs in this house right now. They're in the other room. They may come through. They may bark. They may be noisy. So I can't, I can't, that may happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it's only 12:35. And so I've got 5 dogs. They're rescue dogs. I love them. But you know what? If I decided I didn't want to deal with them anymore, they're my property. I own them. And if I decided I didn't want to deal with them anymore, because you know what, having 5 dogs, it takes a lot of time. It prevents me from traveling, although right now it's the pandemic that's stopping me from traveling. But when there aren't pandemics, the fact that I've got dogs, I have obligations to the dogs. I have obligations. My partner and I have these dogs together, and I have obligations to her to share in the caring of the dogs, etc. But if I said, well, look, this is a pain in the neck. I could kill them right now. As long as I did so humanely, I could kill them. I could drive them to a shelter where I would sign a paper that says, if you can't find a home for these dogs, we will euthanize, i.e. kill these dogs. Euthanize is one of the most misused words in the English language. Killing a healthy animal is never in the interest of an animal. Euthanasia is when death is in the interest of the being killed. So if I get ill and I can't be cured and I'm in a lot of pain and I want to be euthanized, I have made a decision that death is in my interest. If I have a dog who's incurably ill and is suffering, I may make the decision, as I have in the past. We've now had about 25 dogs since we've been together. We've had a lot of rescues, and there's been a number of them that I have had to euthanize because they've gotten cancer, they've gotten some other condition, and they've been suffering, and there's nothing I can do. And I make the decision, although it is my decision, and I take responsibility for it, that when they are suffering and there's nothing I can do to relieve the suffering, then I have to make the decision to euthanize them. But that is because I believe that death is in their interest at that time. If you kill a healthy animal, killing a healthy being is never in the interest of an animal, ever. So when you kill a healthy animal, you don't euthanize the animal, you just kill the animal. That's all. So don't use the word euthanize. It's a misuse of the word. It makes us feel better. Okay, but we're not euthanizing anybody when we kill a healthy animals. We're just killing it. Oh, one of them is here now. Hold on a second. Come over here. This is Duncan. Say hello, everybody. This is Duncan. Duncan is one of our guys. Thank you. Duncan is one of our cruelty cases. When Duncan was found, his mouth was taped shut. His face was cut in 2 pieces, and his tongue was out like this in a balloon. He was almost dead. Okay, you want to get down? Okay, say goodbye. Okay, all right. And his tongue was out to there. They thought he was dead, and they saw that he was still alive, and they sewed his mouth back, and they put him up for adoption, but they wanted somebody who knew how to deal with. We've had a number of abused dogs. As a matter of fact, 4 of our dogs right now are abused animals, and they're all rescues, but 4 of them are actually cruelty cases. And so we've had a lot of experience dealing with rehabilitating dogs that have been in bad situations. But I love Duncan. He's just the most wonderful dog. I just love. They're all wonderful, but I mean, I love him. But if I could kill him right now, he is my property. So we've got to understand this. Animals are property. The only way we relate to them is as property. Okay, that is what their status is in this world. Even wild animals are generally owned. I mean, depending on where you live and what the legal system is. For example, in where I live, the wild animals are actually sort of owned by the state. And when they allow hunting, then you can reduce the individual animal to by shooting the animal with a bow and arrow, which is what they do around here, or a gun, you can reduce the animal to your possession and the animal can become your property. But basically, animals are property. And let's leave wild animals aside. Let's just talk about domestic animals, because wild animals present some other issues, but I want to focus on domestic animals. Domestic animals are property. And they're simply property. I mean, there's nothing complicated about it. They're property. They're owned by somebody. It costs money to own animals. Okay? And so when we talk about animal welfare standards, we're saying, what level? My position is that the level of animal welfare in any particular place at any particular time is more or less that level of care which is required to exploit the animal in an economically efficient way. More or less. I mean, there's some give. We'll talk about that in a second. But it is more or less the case that the level of animal welfare is that level which is required in order to exploit the animal in an efficient way. For example, in this country, and many countries have humane slaughter laws. In this country, unless the slaughter is done for the purpose of, unless or foul slaughter, the animal has to be stunned before the animal is shackled, where the chain is around the leg, and then they pull them up, and then they cut in, they butcher them, they slaughter them. The animal has to be stunned before the animal is shackled, hoisted, and cut. Why is that? I'll tell you why that is. Because if you have a very heavy, large animal hanging upside down by her back leg, her pelvis breaks. I don't know if you've ever been in a slaughterhouse. I've been in lots of them, and they're horrible places. The most humane slaughterhouse is an absolute hellhole, and don't kid yourself. There's no such thing as humane slaughter. Trust me on that. There is no such thing as humane slaughter. It's all horrible. And so if you pull the animal up by her back leg, her pelvis breaks. And that puts her in a lot of pain. You know what she does? She moves around a lot. And you know what happens then? You incur carcass damage. Well, you got a cow that incurs a lot of carcass damage, and you can't sell that meat as United States Department of Agriculture prime. It reduces the value of the animal. If that animal is moving around a lot, that animal hits workers, and then there are lawsuits. So we have so animals have all sorts of interests throughout their lives. But why do we focus on at the moment of their death? We focus on the moment of their death because if we don't do that, it's economically inefficient. It's going to end up costing us more money. If we don't stun them before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. And I will tell you this. The primary reason, we think that these animals are all unconscious when they're killed. That's nonsense. That's wrong. They're stunned, and they're stunned to the extent that they can't move. I've been in slaughterhouses before where it's clear that the animal is conscious, but the animal is unable to move. In the same way that, when you're tasered, if you ever come to visit the United States, be careful about the police because they're taser happy. They taser you, particularly if you're a person of color. Be very careful if you're a person of color. And so If you're given a jolt of electricity, basically you'll be immobilized for a while. But I have seen animals, for example, with pigs, you have to keep the electrodes on their heads. You have to keep the pads on their heads for quite a while, for more than 5 seconds generally. And so what happens when a lot of these places is they take the they're like little pads, and they stick them on the pig. The pig falls over, and then they put the chain around, they hoist the pig up, and then the pig is becoming conscious while the pig is like hanging up, but the pig can't move around a lot. So you're not incurring the carcass damage, and you're not incurring the worker injuries. But in any event, the bottom line is the reason why we have humane slaughter laws is because it's an economically efficient thing to do, which is one reason why those laws don't apply to chickens. Because in 1958, when the humane slaughter law was passed, they didn't apply it to chickens. Why didn't they apply to chickens? Because chickens are small, and we don't think that they're going to have carcass damage, and we don't think that they're going to injure workers. If you look, there's now a campaign. There's now a campaign there has been for a number of years, to shift to a different method of killing chickens, that asphyxiating them, gassing them, basically. Okay. And if you look at the papers put out by the organizations that promote this, for example, the Humane Society of the United States or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, you will see that they've done these reports that indicate that it's economically, you have less carcass damage. And even though chickens are not as valuable as cows or pigs or sheep, you can still cut down the waste of animal flesh if you asphyxiate the animals rather than kill them in the way that they are presently killed, which is basically to hang them upside down while they are fully conscious, put them through an electrifying bath that is supposed to stun them, and then you have a blade going around that's supposed to cut their throat. But because the animals are different sizes and they're moving, sometimes it cuts off the top of their heads, and sometimes, it's a lot of them are not killed properly, and then they have somebody who stands there and cuts the throat if the automatic blade doesn't work. And then they go into what they call a defeathering tank, which is scalding water, which is supposed to get the feathers off so that they can then produce they then have a chicken without feathers. And I remember once being in a chicken slaughterhouse some years ago, and I would say 30% of the animals that went into that scalding water were alive when they were conscious when they went in. They were not. I don't know how conscious they were. They were certainly able to feel the hot water. They certainly acted as though they were able to feel the hot water. And so, it's really horrible. But now we have these campaigns to get animals asphyxiated rather than killed in the way that they're presently killed. And the arguments being made is that it's economically a much better thing to do. Now, I will tell you this: if you were starting a chicken slaughtering operation tomorrow, you would be totally irrational to use the present. If you had money and you were looking to put your money into a chicken slaughtering operation, you'd be insane to put it into a traditional chicken slaughtering operation. You should use an asphyxiation method. Why? Because it's much more economically efficient to do. There will be less carcass damages. There will be fewer worker injuries, because even though the workers are not going to be injured by chickens moving around, they are injured by the electricity. They get burned on the wall. Whenever you have a lot of people working in a hazardous situation, there are worker injuries, right? And so you'd cut down on worker injuries. You'd cut down on carcass damage. You'd cut down on the sorts of things like the present method of killing them. They bleed. They bleed in particular ways that results in some of the meat having to be thrown away, etc. So it's an efficient thing to do. Animal welfare is not about morality, my friends. It is about economics. It is about economics. Don't kid yourself. It has nothing to do with morality. It's about economics. And so, as I have written before, that the animal welfare is a set of standards that a rational property owner would employ. That it's simply it's what rational property owners do, is to adhere to the standards of animal welfare. Now, there's another reason why So what we do for the most part is we defer to industry standards to establish what is necessary suffering. Why is that? Because for the most part, we assume that animal owners are rational. I mean, we assume that I'm not going to take a hammer and I'm going to go out to my garage and start hitting my car for no reason. That would be an irrational thing for me to do. Okay. Why? Because I would be devaluing my property if I were to go out there and start smashing the car with a hammer. We assume that the owners of animal property are rational and that they're not going to impose more suffering on animals than they absolutely need to, because that would be irrational. They would be diminishing the value of their own property. So we generally, there are exceptions, but generally when we look to see what necessary suffering is or what humane standard is, we look to the customs of the industry. We do that for economic reasons, but we also do it for legal reasons. We do it because if these laws, as I mentioned before, are generally criminal laws, okay, and you want people to have notice about what the standard is before you impose criminal liability on them. Criminal liability is a big deal, even if it's only a misdemeanor, we divide. I know very little about the Greek legal system, but the Anglo-American system, it divides criminal liability. Criminal law is another subject I teach, but divides criminal liability between misdemeanors, minor crimes, and felonies. Okay, felonies are serious crimes. All right, you get punished much more heavily for felonies, unless you're Donald Trump, in which case you appear to get away with it. But felonies are minor crimes for the most part, although there are some anti-cruelty laws or some aspects of anti-cruelty laws that carry felony penalties. For the most part, the penalties associated with anti-cruelty violations are pretty light. However, you still have a criminal violation. So if you're applying for a job, and they say, have you ever been convicted of a crime? You have to admit, you have to acknowledge that you were convicted of. Doesn't mean, when you're employed, when you're looking at a job, when you're thinking about a job or you're interviewing for a job, the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor, obviously it's worse to have a felony, but a lot of employers will not employ you if you've had any sort of criminal record, right? And so we want the criminal standard, the standard to be clear. Well, if what cruelty is what some judge or some jury thinks it is, then nobody has any notice about how they're supposed to deal with animals. So we generally want to stick with the industry standard, with the customs of the industry. So whether it's the food industry or the entertainment industry or what hunters generally regard as human, we want to focus on the norms that are shared by the people who engage in that conduct, because we assume that those standards are rational, and we assume that those represent necessity. Okay. Now I want you to think about this. So the economic reason is because animals are property. It costs money to protect their interests, right? I mean, so if I buy a pig for $1 and I'm going to sell that pig in 6 months, well, I'm going to feed that pig. I'm going to lose the use of my dollar for that time because I've got the dollar invested in the pig. So let's say I buy the pig for $1. I spend another 50 cents to feed the pig, another 50 cents to take care of the veterinary costs of the pig. So now 6 months later, the pig cost me $2 plus the use of my money for that time. So we'll say $2 plus. I've got to sell the pig for at least $2 plus that additional money that represents my loss of the use of the money during that time. So I've got to sell it for $2 plus in order to break even. And I've got to sell it for $2 plus in order to make profit. All right. So you come along and you say, you know what? I think you should give your pigs more protection. Okay. I think you should give them larger stalls. And I don't think you should have farrowing crates. And I don't think you should do this, or I don't think and I say, look, fine with me. I'm a capitalist. I'm a business person. Okay. You want bananas? I'll sell you bananas. You want beef or pork or lamb? I'll sell what? I'm a businessman. I'm a capitalist. I'll give the pig greater protection, but it's going to cost more money. It's going to cost me, if you want me to raise this pig in a different situation, it's going to cost me another 50 cents. So now if I sell the pig, for $2.40 under the old scheme, I may make some money. Under the new scheme, I won't, because my capital costs are going to be $2.50. So the bottom line is, for economic reasons, the standards of animal welfare will generally be pegged at the level of efficient exploitation. Now, there are some, that's not a hard and fast rule. Okay? There are some instances in which animal welfare has actually increased production costs. For example, and the primary example that comes up, and I think it's a sort of a sad example, is the European Economic Community's rejection of the conventional battery cage. A 12-year campaign. Think of how much labor, how much effort, how much money went into that campaign for over 10 years to to abolish the conventional battery cage. And what did we end up with? Well, the European Community Directive says that you've got a choice. You can produce the eggs in what is called an enriched cage system, or a cage-free system, or a free-range system. All right. The enriched cage is the cheapest way to do it, and that's exactly what most producers have shifted to the extent, and I mean, there's a question as to whether or not the European community has really come into compliance with this. That's a whole separate question as to whether or not there aren't still a lot of conventional battery cages. But the move to now we have a battery cage, which has now got a little bit more space. It's got a little bit more like nesting area, etc. But it's still a cage. It's still a small cage. It does not in any way really address any of the significant welfare issues. And that's what we've moved to. Now, it does cost more money to produce an egg in an enriched cage system than it does in a conventional cage system. So you can say, well, wait a minute, Francione. This shows that there can be animal welfare shifts to a more, animal welfare shifts that actually result in costing more money and increasing the production cost of animal products. And the answer is, yeah, that's right. There are some examples, but I think if you look at this at the European Community Directive on battery cages, it's a perfect example, even when we depart from the model that I've described. What sort of departure is it? It's useless. The animals are still being tortured, and the egg industry was basically prepared to move in that direction anyway. There were lots of concerns because it wasn't just a question about humane concerns. A lot of people believed that conventional battery cages produced unhealthy eggs. I have no idea why they believed that. I suspect, people have lots of irrational beliefs. In the United States, people have lots of irrational beliefs. And, but people have lots of irrational beliefs. For example, some people think that brown eggs are healthier than white eggs. I have no idea why the hell they think that, but they do. Lots of people, I've met lots of people who say, gee, aren't brown eggs healthier? And, you want to say, why don't you have your head examined? Why do you think that brown eggs are healthier than white eggs? It doesn't make any sense. And so, but there was a lot of concern that conventional battery eggs were unhealthy. And so the move towards, quote, abolishing the conventional battery cage, which is a misdescription of the situation, was based in part on a concern about health issues as well. But the egg industry was preparing to move in that direction anyway. It's not that this sort of completely, upended the egg industry. As a matter of fact, a lot of the large producers were quite happy to go in that direction. Okay, because they were going to go in that direction anyway, and they thought with actually what was in the end not a huge investment, they would actually be able to sell these things for a lot more money because they would be able to sell them as happy eggs, healthy eggs, happy eggs. And that's exactly what they do. So the bottom line is the level of animal welfare is low. It's always going to be low because animals are property. It costs money to protect their interests. We're going to protect their interests to the extent it's economically viable, feasible, desirable. We only protect their interests when we get a benefit, and most of the time, that's an economic benefit exclusively. All right? Now, that becomes an even greater problem in terms of when we're talking about, the economic situation we have now with regional, like you have things like the European Community, you have things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, you have the thing about the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, all these regional agreements. Okay, so if you have one, if you have somebody who's giving the animals more protection, that's going to place them at a competitive disadvantage relative to the people who are giving them, who are not giving them that extended protection. For example, in Britain, animals receive. Britain has amongst the highest animal welfare standards in the world. Nevertheless, the animals in Britain are tortured, just like the animals in the United States, just like the animals in Greece, just the animals every place else. They're tortured. They're tortured a little less. Some of them are tortured a little less in Britain than they are in other places, and that has resulted in a number of the animal industries in Britain really being put at severe competitive disadvantages with producers in France or other in Spain or other places in the European Community. It put them at a competitive disadvantage because you've got these international markets now. Okay, so you're no longer dealing. I mean, as long as you've got the demand for the lower welfare product, the lower welfare product is going to come in and is going to displace the higher welfare product. So it's a real mess, okay, because of the economic situation. But because animals are property, the standard of animal welfare is always going to be very low, because the laws that supposedly protect their interests are criminal laws. We're going to always pretty much defer to industry to define the standard so that the standard is known. So the anti-cruelty laws are useless. They're worthless. They only come in to, if some teenagers, grab a dog off the street and torture the dog, then they might get prosecuted. But by and large, producers of, institutional exploiters are very rarely prosecuted. Almost never, actually. Almost never. So the standard of animal welfare is always very, very low. And so that's the first part of what I said. By the way, are y'all following me okay? Is it okay? Okay. All right. The sad thing is if I wasn't trying to talk slower, I would actually be talking faster. And it just, it's anyway. So that's the part of it where I said, I think animal welfare standards are useless. Animal welfare standards are counterproductive in my view, because they make people feel better about continuing to exploit animals. Okay? The number of people I have met in my life who claim to love animals and care about animals and to be animal rights people who are not vegans. As a matter of fact, relatively speaking, of every 100 people I talk to, and I talk to lots and lots and lots of people, I do these things all the time. I got one today. I got one tomorrow. I got 3. I do these things all the time. And when there's not a pandemic, I do them live. And I speak to zillions of people. And the number of people I talk to who say, I care about animals. I love animals. Animals are important to me. And I always say, are you vegan? And they look at me like I have 2 heads. And they say, well, no, that's extreme. I say, well, then I get into the discussion about, what's actually extreme is that, you claim to love animals and yet you participate directly in their exploitation. And that, in my judgment, is extreme in the sense of being extremely confused. It's like saying I love my wife, but I beat her. That's really that's I think not a bad analogy. If you love animals and you continue to eat them or wear them or use them, you need to reevaluate what you mean by love or what you think love means. And so another aspect, I want to go back to this. It's getting dark, so I want to open my curtains. Hold on a second, please. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of unnecessary suffering. We say that, our conventional wisdom, the animal welfare standard, is we say it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Well, what does that mean? What does necessity mean? Well, if it means anything, it means that we can't justify animal suffering for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. I mean, if I said to you, I think it's really wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on children, human children, but occasionally I love to listen to human children scream, so I torture them occasionally because I enjoy it. You would say, well, wait a minute. If you think it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on children, you can't really believe that if you torture children just because you like to hear them scream. Putting aside the legal issues, you would think that I was a morally very confused person. You'd be right. Because if suffering, what does it mean to say unnecessary suffering? Unnecessary suffering, if it's got any meaning whatsoever, means that we can't justify imposing suffering for reasons of pleasure, reasons of amusement, or reasons of convenience. Because if suffering imposed for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience is necessary, then the rule is meaningless. To say it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, but we impose suffering that is not necessary, means the rule is meaningless. What is our largest use of animals on the planet? For food. Every year on this planet, we kill almost 80 billion land animals. 80 billion. Billion is 1,000 million. 80 billion land animals for food, and we don't know how many sea animals. The lowest estimate I've ever seen is 1 trillion. 1 trillion is 1 million. So we are talking about every year, just 1 year, we kill enough animals. We kill more animals than the total number of human beings who have ever lived on the planet from the time we crawled out of the swamp. We kill more animals in 1 year. Think about that. What's our best justification? What's our justification? We don't need to eat animals to be healthy. I mean, I've been a vegan for almost 40 years and I ain't dead yet. And the interesting thing is, I've got more energy than most of the kids I teach who are like, young enough to be I used to say my children, now I'd say my grandchildren. And I mean, I've got more energy than they have. I sleep 4 hours a night. I very rarely get sick. It's certainly not necessary to eat animal products. Certainly not necessary to eat animal products at all. As a matter of fact, I think the evidence, I'm not a doctor, so I don't like to say, well, you're going to be more healthy if you don't eat animal products, because I'm not a doctor. I think the evidence, though, is quite clear that to the extent, the more animal products you eat, the more you are increasing your risk for cancer, heart disease, and other sorts of things that are going to wipe you out. I mean, obviously, you've got to be a sensible vegan. You can't just eat, when I became a vegan, I say 40 years ago, and my vegan diet in the beginning consisted mostly of potato chips and cigarettes. And that was not a healthy diet. But now I don't do that anymore. And I now eat a very healthy diet. But so you've got to be a healthy vegan. But you certainly aren't going to be less healthy if you're a vegan. I mean, whether you're going to be more healthy if you're a vegan, I think you will, but I'm not a doctor. It is clear. I don't think anybody maintains you're going to be less healthy if you are a vegan, and you have a good diet than if you eat animal products. So we don't need to eat animal products for health. We eat animal products for one reason, or actually two reasons. We like the taste. And it's tradition. We do it. That's just what we do. We have all been raised in ethnic, in situations, like I come from an Italian American background. So meatballs and all this, stuff and whatnot. And that's what you're raised with. And it's your traditional food. And when you stop eating that stuff, your mother freaks out and gets upset because, your parents think you're rejecting them, that you're rejecting that, all that stuff. But so we do it for traditional reasons. We do it because it tastes good. It's not necessary. We inflict suffering and death on more animals in 1 year than the total number of human beings that have ever lived on the planet. And the best justification we got is, well, we like the taste, or we've been doing it for a long time. Well, you know what? We've been doing sexism for a long time. As a matter of fact, I think sexism probably is the longest running tradition in the history of humankind, and it is pervasive, and it's 2021, and it still exists pretty badly, actually. Pretty badly. I don't know what the numbers are in Greece, but in the United States, if you get to age 22, you got a 1 in 4 chance of being a rape victim or attempted rape victim. 1 out of 4, and that's what we know. My guess is it's higher. So so what? You can say, well, but sexism is a tradition. Sure as hell is. Doesn't make it right. So the fact that we've been doing something for a long time doesn't make it right. And we've been, racism is also a very serious problem, particularly here. But sexism, sexism is really quite an intriguing one because it is pervasive. It is absolutely pervasive. It exists everywhere. And it still exists everywhere in 2021. At least a lot of people now are willing to sort of say, well, racism is really a bad idea. And people will say that sexism is a bad idea, but it's still practiced everywhere. Women are still treated in a completely different way, and they are valued for completely different qualities. And it is pervasive. Okay. The thing is, I would never have gotten to where I have gotten to if I was either a person of color or a woman. And I acknowledge that. If I was a woman and I took the positions I took, I would be dismissed as extreme or shrill or this or that, the way we dismiss women. We do it all the time. So what? So the fact that we do something doesn't make it right. We do it for a long time doesn't make it right. Traditions, as far as I'm concerned, have no moral value whatsoever. They may be nice in certain respects, but they have no moral value. None whatsoever. And so our largest use of animals is not necessary. And I would venture that I would say this. Our only use of animals, which is not transparently frivolous, the only one is the use of animals to find cures for serious human illnesses. Or when they take like a valve out of a pig heart and they stick it in your chest to keep your heart going, that sort of stuff. Now, I don't think that's morally justifiable. I think that that's wrong. But at least you got to talk about that. There's something to talk about there. There is something to talk. The rest of it, use of animals for food, use of animals for clothing, use of animals for entertainment, use of animals for sport hunting, all this stuff is not necessary. So the standard of we say, well, we're all opposed to unnecessary suffering. What the hell does that mean? When most of the suffering we impose is unnecessary, we end up with a standard that the standard is we oppose unnecessary suffering. That's what it is. Now think about that for a second. That's mind-boggling. That what we really oppose is unnecessary suffering. In other words, simple sadism. That can be ruled out. That can be prosecuted under anti-cruelty laws. That can be ruled out. Nothing else is. And so not only is this all useless, but what it does is it makes us feel better. There's a store by my house called Whole Foods. Whole Foods is a big American chain it's an expensive store. They sell a lot of organic stuff and whatnot. You go to their meat counter and they've got 5 levels of torture. Level 5 is the most expensive, and those are the animals. Those animals have been killed on the farm where they've been raised. And then level 1 is, somebody sings to them. And level 1 is a little bit of welfare, improved welfare. Level 2, a little bit more. Level 3, a little bit more. Level 4, a little bit more. Level 5. You can choose what people go there and they buy stuff and they think they're doing a favor to animals because they're spending more money so they can purchase more welfare protection. And who told them that that was a good thing to do? The animal organizations. In 2005, when Whole Foods was rolling this program out, it was Peter Singer who made a public statement. If you'd like, I'll be happy to send you the public statement. And it used to hang in the Whole Food stores. They used to have it at the cash register. And it was on the Whole Foods website for a couple of years. And it was a statement by Peter Singer saying, we appreciate and support your animal compassionate standards. And it was signed by Peter Singer, PETA, Viva, Mercy for Animals, Farm Sanctuary, all of the big American, and Viva's a British American group, or at least it used to, was then. They had a branch in the United States. I don't think they have one anymore. But it was signed by all the big welfare organizations. What message did that send out? That message sent out, the message that was sent out is you can be an animal person and still continue to eat animals as long as you eat humanely produced animals. It's nonsense. Okay? Even if those animals are treated better than the animals that are, in other words, these programs that stores like Whole Food have, these are voluntary. These are not mandated by law. Okay? You've got the animal welfare laws mandate this level. And so if you're a private producer, you can produce a higher level of animal welfare as a businessman. You're not required to do it. You do it because you perceive there's a demand. And there is a demand. There's a demand because you've got an animal movement, which is telling people that they don't have to be vegan, that they can be animal people by buying higher welfare animal products. As far as I'm concerned, that's insidious. I think that's really wrong. And I think these animal organizations, and I will tell you in the interest of disclosure, in the early 1980s, before most of you were born, and I was a young lawyer, I actually did a lot of huge amounts of volunteer work for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, for PETA. I was involved with PETA when there were about 10 of us. When I got involved, when Anna and I got involved with PETA, there were about 10 people, and it was a very small organization. And I, as they got larger and they got larger and they got larger, they got more corrupt and more corrupt and more corrupt. And they bought into this idea that what animal rights was making animal slavery a little bit better. And I don't see it that way. As far as I'm concerned, animals have a right to respectful treatment, which means you do not use them exclusively as means to end. I have a new book coming out now. It should be out in about 3 weeks, I hope. It's called Why Veganism Matters, the Moral Value of Animals. And a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today is explained there in a more condensed way, because I've got like other books in which I discuss these ideas in more detailed ways. But and one of the things I talk about there is that animals don't need to have. We think that animals are different from us cognitively. They are. I mean, they don't think the same way we think. They don't use symbolic communication. I frankly don't know how they think, because I can't understand what thinking is. I don't understand what cognition means without words, without concepts, because that's the sort of animal I am. That's the sort of animal you are. Now, my dogs, they think. They clearly think. How they think, I have no idea, because they don't use language. So I'm not sure what their cognitive processes are like. And you know what? I don't really care. They can feel pain. They are connected to their future self. They may not be connected to their future selves in the sense that I'm connected saying, well, next year I'll have a sabbatical. And if there's no pandemic, where am I going to go for my sabbatical? They're not thinking that way. Okay. But they're thinking, they clearly think, and they're clearly connected to the next second of their consciousness, the next second of their awareness. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all you need. That's the only connection with your future self that you need to have in order to have an interest in continuing to live. And my view is, if you're sentient, then we shouldn't be using you exclusively as a means to an end. Okay? I don't care how it's not a question of smarts. It's not a question of intelligence. It's not a question of, we think, animals are, elephants are different because, they're monogamous, or who cares whether they're monogamous? I mean, their moral status is not dependent on whether they grieve when another one of their troops members die, or whether they're monogamous, or whether there's who cares? I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting if you're interested in animal behavior, but it doesn't tell us anything morally that's relevant. And so I argue that sentience alone is the only thing that is needed to have the right not to be property. And that means we cannot treat you exclusively as a means to an end. But it also means we shouldn't be bringing you into existence in the first place, because I'm opposed to domestication. I love my dogs. I love them to bits. But if there were only 2 dogs left on the planet and it were up to me, so whether or not they continue to breed so that we could have pets, the answer would be not on your life. Absolutely not. We shouldn't be producing domesticated animals at all. And before you say, well, wait a minute, they'll go into extinction. They aren't naturally occurring species. They are beings that we genetically engineered through selective breeding. And now we do it in more sophisticated ways. But they're basically beings we brought into existence. And the reason why we engineered them the way they did was to be submissive and subservient to us. I do not think we can justify domestication. In my perfect world, there are no domesticated animals. There's us and there's the animals that live out there, and we got to leave them alone. But we're not living in my ideal world. We don't live with them. We don't eat them. We don't wear them. We don't use them. They are a separate. They are them. They are them. They live their lives. We live our lives. The idea that we have pets. I love my dogs. They're great, but they're dependent on me for every aspect of their lives. When they eat, when they drink. Right now, I'm sure they're upset with me because it's 1:19 in the afternoon and they usually eat at 1 o'clock. So they probably have little doggy watches out saying, where is that son of a bitch? How come he's not feeding us? But they're dependent on me and Anna for every aspect of their lives. She's not feeding them because if she did, there would be such a cacophony of barking that it would be impossible for us to continue. So, but they're dependent. I mean, they're subservient. The reason why they exist is because we like this idea of relating to them, but we want them to be obedient. We want them to be subservient. We want them to be submissive. That's what domestication is all about. And I think it's vile. I think it's morally indefensible, and I think it ought to stop. So that's in my perfect world, there is no continued domestication. Okay. And with respect to the non-domesticated animals, leave them alone. Let them live their lives. Don't interfere with their lives. Don't continue to destroy their habitats. Don't interfere with them. I mean, I have a moral issue because we moved out of New York City some years ago. Because it's hard to have 5 dogs in New York City. Trust me. And so we moved out of New York City. We got some land. We've got about 5 acres here. And I got a lot of deer in the bag. And we get snowstorms here. I mean, we get like serious snow. Like you get 3 feet, you can get 3 feet of snow here easily. And so, the deer are hungry. Now, part of me says I shouldn't interfere with them, and, the ones that die should die. But, but I sometimes, buy corn and lug 300 pounds of corn out there when there are really bad storms and, to feed them. And so, but generally, we really shouldn't be interfering with them. And I always feel guilty when I do that because I don't really know. I mean, I'm morally troubled because on one hand, I say I shouldn't interfere. On the other hand, I say they're starving. I see them hanging around in the backyard. And sometimes they jump the fence and they sort of come up to they get very close to us. And it's very troubling to me because I don't know what to do. I don't know what the morally right thing is. But that's in my perfect world, there are no domesticated animals. I want to run through the 6 points of the abolitionist approach to animal rights, which is a theory that I have been developing for the past, since 1990, 89, 90, that I've been developing. It basically has 6 principles. One is every sentient being has the right not to be used as property. Every sentient being has the right not to be used as property. The second principle is that if animals have the right not to be used as property, then we ought not to be promoting humane exploitation. We ought to be promoting no exploitation. Okay. And also, let me a footnote here. I also oppose single issue campaigns. For example, when we have these campaigns about, like for example, in the United States, every few years, there's a campaign against foie gras, which is, the liver, which is produced from overfeeding the geese. And there's a campaign against that. Now, I always think that's a dumb campaign. It's dumb and it's counterproductive because what it's doing is it's encouraging people to think that there's a distinction between foie gras and steak. There isn't. It's encouraging people to believe that they're morally better if they don't eat foie gras and they eat steak instead. I think that that's problematic. I think that encourages exploitation. And, the same thing, like, you have these campaigns here against killing dogs in China, eating dogs. This is a big thing we have. Big, big, big thing. Do I oppose eating dogs? Of course I oppose eating dogs. But I find it odd that you have people who eat chicken, fish, pork, beef. We say, oh, those Asian people, they're evil because they eat dogs. I think these campaigns are totally problematic. So that's the second principle. I reject animal welfare campaigns and single issue campaigns. The third thing is veganism is a moral baseline. Okay, veganism is a moral baseline. That is, if animals matter, if they're not things, we have an obligation to go vegan. Vegetarianism isn't enough. There's no morally coherent distinction between flesh and dairy or eggs or these other products. There's no distinction. There's no morally coherent distinction. There's as much suffering in a glass of milk as there is in a pound of steak. This idea that we draw this line. I always find this very curious. People say, well, I'm a vegetarian. And that when I hear that, I always think, what leads to that conclusion? Because animals used for dairy and eggs are usually kept alive longer. They're treated every bit as bad, if not worse. And they end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. So, it's like, why do we think that there's a distinction? I have to tell you, I've been in a lot of bad places in my life. I've been in slaughterhouses. I've been on factory farms. I've been in vivisection labs. I've been in a university for 35 years of my life. I have been, I've been able to go into labs, not so much now, but when I was younger. And I don't need to see that stuff anymore. I know what goes on in those places. But one of the worst experiences I ever had, some of the worst memories I have, are dairy farms. Dairy farms are horrible places, absolutely hideous, monstrous places. Where in order to have milk, you got to keep the cow pregnant, right? Cow has to be pregnant. She has a calf. They take the calf away. Have you ever seen what happens when you take a calf away from a cow, or any mammal away from the mammal's mother? They freak out. They suffer. The cows. I still remember this one dairy farm I spent several days at. It was supposedly a more humane dairy farm. They allowed the calves to stay with their mothers for a couple of days. Then they took them away. And those cows would cry for days. And they would try to follow the calves. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And the males are sold sometimes they're just killed, or they're sold for veal. And the females are cycled into the dairy industry. It's a horrible industry. If you're not eating meat because you object to killing animals, cut out the milk, cut out the eggs, all the other. There's no way to draw the line. So veganism is the moral baseline. We may owe animals more, but we certainly owe them at least that, to not participate directly in their exploitation. The fourth principle is that sentience is the only characteristic which is necessary. You don't need to have human-like intelligence. This is, in my book, I describe this as the problem of similar minds. Animals matter if they have similar minds. My view is, as long as they have a mind, that's all that matters. Plants don't have minds. I don't mind eating plants. Because if any of you wish to say to me, why do I think plants aren't sentient? I'm happy to answer your question, although I will secretly hate you. I'm only kidding. I always think, you always get the two things together that you get all the time are, what about plants? And the other thing you get generally from the same person is, Hitler was a vegetarian. The answer was, Hitler was not a vegetarian, and it wouldn't matter because he wasn't a vegan anyway. And what difference does that make? Stalin and Mao ate a lot of meat. What the hell does that say? You can't make these arguments are silly. So as long as you have a mind, that's all that matters. Okay. And that if you have a mind, you've got the right not to be property. One right, the right not to be property. But recognizing that right has a profound impact. One of you said, I got a couple of questions that Vicky sent me. One of them is, I only recognize a negative right. Yeah, I only recognize the negative right not to be property, but it means you get rid of domestication. I'm not really interested I don't agree with Will Kimlicka, where these people who say that, well, we can incorporate domesticated animals into our political system. I think that's nonsense. I didn't even know what he's talking about. And I had a whole symposium at Rutgers University one day, and Will and Sue Sue Donaldson, who they wrote Zoopolis, and the two of them came, and we had a day-long seminar. I came out of the seminar. I still don't know what he means when he talks about integrating animals into the political system. I have no idea. I mean, it's a sort of an idea about continued benign exploitation from what I can tell. But my view is domesticated animals shouldn't exist. Okay. So yes, it's a negative right. Whoever asked me that question. Yes, it's a negative right, but it's a negative right with profound implications, because it means you don't have to worry about the other aspect. I mean, if we stop domesticating animals, then we don't have to worry about what other rights should they have. If we respected them at all, they wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be bringing them into existence. The fifth thing is that we should object to all forms of discrimination. What we do with animals is we otherize them. We treat them as the other, in the same way we treat women, people of color, gay people, trans people, all these other. We draw this line, and we stick them on the other side of the line. And I object to that. I think that all that line drawing is just wrong. So my view is that unless you just want to be a misanthrope, engage in misanthropy and sort of say, I hate humans. I love animals, but I hate humans. We have to object to all forms of discrimination, which is one of the reasons. There were several reasons why I broke from PETA. One of the reasons, only one, there were others. One of the reasons why I broke from PETA was because the I'd Rather Go Naked Than Refer campaign, which started in 1989, when they started with this idea that they were going to use sexism to try to educate people about speciesism, which I thought was idiotic, to say the least. The idea that we're going to encourage people to engage in sexism so that we can get them to respect the rights of animals struck me as being profoundly wrong-headed. And actually, PETA's gotten worse over the years in terms of its sexist campaigns that get worse and worse every year. Why? Because that's what you got to do when you're playing to the media for that sort of stuff. You got to keep ratcheting it up. So now they have all of these really objectionable campaigns, which go beyond, what the original thing was of people women walking around naked, handing out veggie dogs or whatever they were doing. Now it's gotten much more involved, and in my judgment, sexist, much more misogynistic. So, and I think we have to reject all that stuff. And it bothers me, there are a lot of these animal people, like Anonymous for the Voiceless. I've had a number of discussions with those people. They take a very right-wing view. I mean, they believe, the animal movement should include the men's rights movement, and that right-wing people, I'm sorry, but the animal rights movement, if you conceptualize it properly, is a movement of the left. I'm sorry. I'll be happy to debate that with you, but you can't sort of take animals and sort of plug animals and view animals as a separate entity, separate group, and not be concerned about violence against human beings, otherization of human beings. And so I think that that's really a very important thing to do. The fifth thing is it's nonviolence. I see the movement that I'm a part of, the movement I've been trying to develop, is a part of the peace movement that I grew up in when I was a hippie back in the 1960s. In my judgment, the movement ought to be a peace movement that just encompasses the non-human animals. Violence is the problem. If violence, I've had this argument with people who believe in violence, to use violence. It doesn't really make any sense. And violence is the problem. It's not the solution. If violence was the solution for anything, we'd be living in the Garden of Eden right now. Because in case you haven't noticed, the history of humankind is the history of violence. We are a violent group of beings. And it hasn't gotten us to a peaceful situation yet, has it? No. Okay. And I don't think violence ever gets us anywhere. And I remember some years ago, I was in Canada. I've been in Canada many times, but one of the times I was in Canada, I was speaking at the University of Guelph. I still remember this very well. And somebody stood up and said she was I don't remember if she said she was I think she said she was a spokesperson. So I had some relationship with the Animal Liberation Front. And she asked me, you take a nonviolent position. She said, so if a vivisector is using 60 animals a year, 60 dogs a year. I think she used dogs a year for experiments. Don't you think it's justifiable to kill that person, or or do you believe? I don't know if she said kill or physically interfere with that person. And I said I don't think it's acceptable to use violence. And we got into a discussion. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, are you a vegan? She said, yeah. I said, your mother a vegan? She said, what's my mother got to do with it? I said, just follow me here. She said, your mother vegan? And she said, no. She said, but my mother doesn't eat beef. I remember she said that. My mother doesn't eat beef. I said, okay. What's your mother eat? And she said, she eats chicken. I said, does she eat chicken like once a week? She said, probably twice or three times a week. And I said, your mother's killing more than 60 chickens a year. Is it okay to kill your mother? And she said, it's not the same thing. I said, it's exactly the same thing. I said, promoting violence, in order to help animals is one of the most profoundly silly things. 98% of the world exploits animals. Having as an agenda the use of violence against animal exploiters is a prescription for disaster. And if you want to be consistent, it means you got to kill your mother, father, lover, whatever, sisters, brothers, aunts, anybody who's not vegan. You going to take that position? If you are, I don't want to be near you, but that's a position you got to take. So I am opposed to violence. And so that's it. That's the 6 principles of my abolitionist approach. And so now I will breathe and you can ask me questions.
Many thanks for this very interesting talk. I would like to ask the first question before opening up the floor to questions.
Sure.
And actually, I want to ask something regarding regulation. So,
Yeah.
in your view, I'm a lawyer as well. Should we, let's say, speak about veganism on a voluntary or on an obligatory basis? Should we make veganism, in your view, obligatory? A law that prohibits eating meat, for example, or meat products?
I've lost the screen now. I'm not very good with it when it comes to. I went to get rid of the chat because it was interfering with my vision.
I'm afraid it's my fault. I did something nasty here.
Why'd you do that, man?
It wasn't on purpose, but I log out just to get rid of this.
Vicky, could you help us with that?
Just a moment.
It says a viewing whiteboard. You got to get rid of that, maybe. Let me answer the question.
Someone's accidentally sharing. You can reply to the question, and I'll try to.
I will reply to the question. The answer to the question is no. I don't think it should be imposed. I don't think you can impose it. If you wanted to have a revolution here, the fastest way to do it would be to say that people, that we're gonna bar this. This has got to be what I call a revolution of the heart. This has got to be what we need to do is build a vegan movement of people who recognize that animals are non-human persons and that we have a moral obligation not to treat them as things. As a matter of fact, in my new book, I dedicate the book to animal people who aren't vegan yet, because I say if there's many people, many millions and millions of people who think animals matter morally, but who continue to eat them, wear them, and use them. If those people would see their moral obligation to become vegan, we would have a serious political movement, and then we might get regulation that actually incrementally shut down aspects of industry in an incremental way. But right now we don't have that, we don't have that movement. I remember many years ago, in 1985 to be precise, there was a big meeting in Washington of the animal organizations as to what the strategy of the animal movement ought to be. And I remember saying it ought to be one thing: focus on vegan education. And people thought I was crazy and said, well, but that's just not practical. I said, no, it's the only practical thing. The only way we're ever going to change the world is if we build a vegan movement of people who sort of see that animal slavery is just not an acceptable institution, however supposedly humanely you do it. But we need, in order to have it go beyond regulation, in order to get any meaningful regulation, you need to have a real serious movement of vegans. We don't have that right now. We don't really have that right now. There's never really been a vegan movement. The movement right now, the animal movement right now, is not a vegan movement. It's a movement that says, well, we think veganism is a really good thing, but you don't have to be a vegan as long as you're doing something and taking baby steps and blah, 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 blah. That's sufficient. So no, I don't think that, excuse me, I don't think that we should impose it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, in a very clear way. I mean, I actually, you support a voluntary, education-based, let's say, move towards veganism. This is
No, that's exactly what I devote my life to.
yeah, but I mean, this is something completely different from saying, say that this should be obligatory. It should be a criminal law or something like that. Okay, so
no, I mean, if we ever had a vegan society, I would be willing to support a law that says you can't eat animals. But right now, that would be stupid. I mean, 98% of the people eat animals. They wear animals. They use animals.
Yeah, because my second sub question, actually, that I'm not sure if I should pose, is how effective. What is the strategy of effectiveness in terms of what you support, and what the steps should be in terms of, let's say, influencing the regulatory policy in terms of both the US and Greece or the European Union and so on. I mean, how effective these arguments could be. Now the screen is...
Okay, now we're back. Now we're back. Good to see you, Alex. Nice to see you. I mean,
in terms even of political expediency, in terms of arguing effectively regarding the subjects and influencing the policymakers.
Look, my view is I don't have a choice. If I want to change the world, the only way to do it is through creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. That's the only way to do it. I think regulation is useless. As I've said, I think regulation is not only useless, it's counterproductive. So I don't do anything. When people try to get me involved in regulatory efforts, I tell them I don't do that anymore. I just don't do that anymore. That's not what I do. I don't see that as an option, because all that does is reinforce animal exploitation. It doesn't make it any better. It doesn't change anybody's mind. All it does, as far as I'm concerned, is people say, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was visiting with some people in Britain a couple of years ago, and they were professors at a university, and we were sitting in their backyard, and they had a chicken thing set up, like a chicken house, and there were no chickens in it. And I said, why do you have this? And they said, well, we used to rescue chickens when when there was a conventional battery cage, but now that there's no longer, now that they're outlawed, we don't rescue chickens anymore. And I said, do you eat eggs? And she said, oh yes, we eat eggs. And I was thinking, this is exactly the problem. These are two people, both professors, both highly educated people, and they're eating eggs because they think that the eggs produced in accordance with the European directive are somehow morally acceptable eggs. This is the problem with animal welfare. People are just going to continue doing it. So as far as I'm concerned, the only choice I have is to engage in creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy to try to change people's hearts. And so this is what I do. Now, look, I'm tenured. I don't have to do anything. I can stay in my job. We have laws that protect me from age discrimination. And even though I'm in a few years going to be 70 years old, they can't get rid of me. I can be here forever. But the bottom line is that, so I do this stuff every day. Nobody pays me to do it. As a matter of fact, I will not accept fees to speak. I do not accept money to do this work. I give all my book royalties away, I do not take money to do this. I've never taken money to do this. And I do it because I believe in it. And I believe in it because I see how it works. So I can go into an auditorium. I'll tell you another story. I can give a talk. I'll tell you about a specific. I was speaking to a group of young people at a university, probably, I would say 3 years ago. I was speaking to a lot of kids back then, but this particular place, I gave a talk. It was a very large number of young people. And I went into to the auditorium and I said, how many of you all know Michael Vick? Now, Michael Vick is an American football player who got in trouble and he was put in jail because he was involved in dog fighting. And so every kid put up his or her hand because they all knew who Michael Vick was. And I said, Michael Vick was a bad guy, right? Yeah, he was a bad guy. I said, why was he a bad guy? Well, he killed those dogs. I said, yeah, but we all think it's okay to kill dogs, or most of us think it's okay to kill dogs if you're trying to find a cure for cancer, don't we? And student said, yeah, I guess that's okay. I said, so it wasn't just that he killed the dogs, right? Why are you upset about him? And eventually, I do these sorts of things all the time. And within 3 minutes, I will get some student to say, what he did was bad because he killed the dogs for pleasure. He had no good reason to do it. He did it because he enjoyed it. And I said, that's bad, isn't it? Yeah, that's bad. I say, okay, how many of y'all are vegans? And I'll have several hundred people, students sitting there, and I'll get 7, 8, 10, 12 hands, 15 hands, 20 hands. And I say, why aren't the rest of you vegan? I don't understand this. And then we'll have a 3-hour discussion about how does it make sense to say that Michael Vick, this famous celebrity football player, is a bad guy who should have gone to jail because he engaged in dogfighting and he killed dogs because he enjoyed what he did. And the rest of us go to the store and we buy corpses in packages. We bring them home and we eat them because we like the taste. How are we any morally different? What's remarkable to me is how many people have never thought about that question. And when you get them to think about that question, and the reason why I give you that particular example is because just yesterday, I got an email. I got a lot of emails after that. So when I give these talks in colleges, I will get a lot of follow-up emails. And I got an email just yesterday from I think it was about 3 years ago, from 3 years ago, from a student who said, I heard you speak. I was so angry with you because I thought you were so black and white and closed-minded, blah, 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 blah. And I've been thinking about this for 3 years and you're right. And I've now become a vegan. And so I see how it works. I see how it works when I say to somebody, you love your dog, don't you? Yeah. What's the difference between the dog you love and the chicken you stick a fork into? And realize people have never encountered that sort of inquiry before. And so I keep doing how it works. And there are people, the movement that I'm a part of is the movement of people who are out there on the street educating in creative, nonviolent ways. And they don't judge people, but they do judge actions. My view is if you aren't a vegan, I'm not God. I'm not a priest. I can't see into your heart. I'm not really interested in judging you, but I am interested in telling you that your action can't be morally justified. What your motivation is, what the state of your spirit, psyche, soul, whatever the hell you want to call it, is not my business. But it is my business to say that you cannot justify animal exploitation if you animals matter. Now, if you think animals don't matter at all, then there's really not a hell of a lot I can say to you. I mean, if you say, if you and I are talking about racism and you say, well, frankly, I think people of color are inferior and I think that they're genetically inferior and I think that they should be enslaved, there's not a hell of a lot we can talk about. But if you think that if you reject the idea that animals are things and you accept that they are non-human persons, you cannot justify continuing to exploit them. You just can't do it. And so what I find is that educating people in this way and sort of engaging people in a non-confrontational way, but in a very clear way, really works tremendously. And there may be, I don't know. I saw that Roger, are you there, Roger? Roger, are you there? I saw you on. I thought I saw your name, Roger Yates. Are you there, Raj? Well, if Roger Yates is there, Roger Yates does this sort of stuff. He's been doing this sort of stuff for a long time too. And I'm sure he can tell you his own stories about how people really sort of don't think clearly about this. And they don't think clearly about this in large part because there's a structure of careerist organizations that basically are businesses, and they've got to keep their donor pool very, very broad. So PETA is not going to talk to you this way. Friends of, Mercy for Animals is not going to talk to you this way. Okay. And so they're not interested in sort of making it clear. If you tell them I'm a potential donor, but I continue to eat eggs, they ain't going to tell you that it's wrong to eat eggs. It's a business. So I think part of the problem is these large organizations are absolutely counterproductive, absolutely counterproductive. But I think if you talk to people who do vegan advocacy, I think you'll find that their experience is much like my experience. You know, it doesn't mean you change everybody. You don't. It doesn't mean that, you know, but you do. I mean, I do this every time when I'm at the grocery store, and, you know, and I'm sitting there, I'm in line with my 12 heads of, I eat a huge amount of kale. As a matter of fact, if they ever find kale is harmful for you, I will probably be dead. But so I will have like 12 heads of kale in my cart. And I'll have some person, you know, it's very common that people look at my cart and say, wow, you eat healthy. And I say, yeah, I'm a vegan. And I say, oh, really? You know, and then they'll ask me about, you know, how long have you been a vegan? I say, you know, 40 years or almost 40 years. They say, almost 40 years. I say, yep. And, you know, and they say, gee, you know, is it healthy? And I say, look, you know, look at your cart. You're buying decomposing flesh, cow mucus, and chicken ova. And you're asking me whether or not my kale is healthy. You know, let's think about this for a second. And you know, and I mean, I engage people wherever, whether it's in a grocery store or whether my dogs are, you know, if my dogs are in the car and somebody comes up to the car and says, oh, your dogs are so cute or something. And, you know, and I have dogs, and I let them take out pictures of their dogs, and they show me their pictures. And then I follow up and I say, you know, isn't it interesting how we love animals, but we treat them so horribly? And, you know, that some animals we regard as members of our family, and some animals we regard as food. What is the logic there? So I do it every chance I get. I never let an opportunity go by. When I'm making plane reservations and I say I need an absolutely strict vegan meal, no dairy. I don't want any butter on the plate. I don't want any animal products on that plate. And then I'll get involved with the person who's making the reservation for me. And, you know, I mean, the last time I have made plane reservations in over a year, but the last time I made plane reservations, I had a long talk with the woman who was making the reservations for me about why I was a vegan. I talk to anybody who will listen. Anytime, anywhere, any place. That's what I do. And so that's what I think. If all of the people who cared about animals did that, we could change the world. I'm quite convinced we could change the world.
Let's open the floor to questions. So who would like to ask a question?
I would like to ask a question, please, if I may.
Sure.
So my question for Professor Francione is, since the aim of the animal rights movement and animal advocate is the abolition of other animals' use, don't you find that it's counterproductive to spend time talking about conditions and torture and treatment? I mean, the way I see it, even if there was a way to kill other animals painlessly, even if they had a very happy and very long life, it still would be wrong to kill them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely great point. And I say that to people, even if it were possible, I don't even know what humane treatment means, but even if it were possible to humanely raise them, it would still be wrong to kill them, even if you did it painlessly, because you're taking their lives and you have no right to do that. And so I agree. But the problem, what's your name? Is it Nela?
Nella.
No. The problem, Nella, is the world we live in is a world in which the conversation, the discourse is shaped in terms of humane treatment. And that's the problem. So it's yes, I agree with you. It would be wrong even if it was humane. But since the reality is it's never going to be humane, whatever that means, you're never going to get to that point. Animals are going to be tortured under and the most humanely produced animals are tortured. I think it's important for people to understand that. But you know, one of the reasons why, but I will tell you, earlier when I was teaching, I used to show people Earthlings and these sorts of gory slaughterhouse movies. And I stopped doing it. And I stopped doing it, Neela, because it encourages the students to think that the problem is we need to make this better. We need to improve this. And so I stopped. I don't show gory movies anymore. I don't show the violent movies anymore. Because I always tell the students, look, what goes on in slaughterhouses is horrible. But the point is not to sort of freak you out with a lot of blood and guts and gore, because I don't want, and I tell them honestly, I say, look, I don't want to focus you on the treatment issues. I want to focus you on use. If someone's got their microphone going, and I'm getting a lot of feedback, if you can shut your microphone down, I appreciate it. And so what I want to do is I want to focus you on use, not on treatment. So I agree with you, but I also think that the background noise that everybody comes to this issue with is the background noise of humane treatment, because that's what they're taught to think, the framework that they're taught to think in by all of these large organizations, which dominate the discourse.
I think that if we use the rights approach as given by Tom Regan, we could cut through that. If we could talk only about basic moral rights.
Well, in my new book, I spent a lot of time talking about that. I was very close with Tom Regan, and although I like Tom's framework a whole lot more than I like Peter Singer's framework, Tom's framework was in certain ways problematic, because I don't want to sort of give a short description and sort of, because it's actually a longer discussion. The part of the problem was Tom did buy into some anthropomorphic views. For example, he said in situations of conflict, in certain situations of conflict, you should prefer the human over the non-human because the human has greater opportunities for satisfaction. I think that that's problematic, and I think it's wrong. He also links moral status with this idea of the subject of a life, which is very, very much like they've got cognition, which is, that they're similar to us. I think that's problematic. I mean, Tom never really took an abolitionist perspective in the case for animal rights. For a while in the 90s, he and I were working together, but then he, part of the problem is Tom then abandoned that abolitionist work and reunited with the welfare organizations. So it's not really clear. I mean, I certainly believe in rights and not in utility. And when you said before, animal people want to abolish animal exploitation, the answer is not all of them. Lots of them don't want to abolish it. As a matter of fact, I get criticized for it all the time, that because I want to abolish it, my position is too extreme. That's exactly what Will Kimlicka's position is. His position is, my view is too extreme because I want to abolish domestication. I want to abolish animal use. My view is that that's the only thing that makes sense. So, so yeah, I mean, I don't agree with the utility. I mean, in many ways, and I argue this in my book, Tom's position and Peter's position end up being closer than you think, because the practical effect of what they're arguing is, Tom basically says, for example, he's not sure what you do if an animal is sentient but doesn't have preference, autonomy, and isn't the subject of a life. He's not clear. As a matter of fact, what he says is it's radically unclear how merely sentient beings can have inherent value. In my view, if they have sentience, that's all they need for inherent value. So, I mean, as far as I know, my position is the only one that links a strong rights position with sentience alone. I don't know of anybody else who did that, except for Bridget Brophy, who was a British writer from the 1960s, who was very important. Although because she was a woman, her work was ignored it continues to be ignored. But Bridget Brophy, who wrote in the 1960s, she's dead now. But Bridget connected moral value with sentience alone. But as far as I know, we're the only two human beings on the planet who have done that. So we'll see.
Thank you, Professor Francione.
Sure.
Next question.
Can you hear me, Professor? Good evening.
Yeah, I can hear you. Who's speaking?
Very much. It was a real pleasure attending your lecture. I am a veterinarian. I am a companion animal professional.
Yeah.
So I would like to focus on one exception. I'd like to refer to pet-assisted therapy. In the United States, you know it very well. It's about therapy dogs, therapy horses, therapy rabbits. And in terms of you mentioning that you're against any kind of domestication and exploitation, my point of view is that both human animals are sentient beings. If we completely abolish domestication, then what in fact we're doing is prohibiting health professionals from alleviating pain in special groups of people. It has been proven that the bond between the therapy animal and chronic patients, children with dyslexia, brain tumors, any kind of neurologic disorders, this special bond cannot be replaced with anything else. No medication, no treatments, nothing. So do you have you ever thought about this?
All the time. And the answer is, I don't. That's like saying, we need to have dogs because blind people need dogs. And the answer is, look, or, another use of it. I mean, there's another use of animals that we make where people who are quadriplegics, they have monkeys that have shock collars, and the monkeys will, when you shock the monkey will go to your cupboard and get your drink and bring it to you because you can't get out of your wheelchair. There are all sorts of ways in which animals help humans. I have no doubt about that. The question is you have to ask that question in the context of, let's assume we didn't have any animals, there were no domesticated animals. Would it be appropriate to bring animals into existence? So to train them to be seeing eye dogs, or to be, to help quadriplegics, or to help kids with autism or whatever. And the answer is, look, no, I don't think we can use them as means to our ends. I don't think you can justify domestication. The fact that they help humans doesn't mean it's okay to do. And so therefore I would not, my view is that you can't start making exceptions, because once you make exceptions, then what you're doing is you're saying there are some situations in which you can bring, look, I think domestication is horrible. I think these domesticated animals live in this, what I call this netherworld of vulnerability. They're not humans and they're not animals. They're sort of stuck in between. They live in our world, and they are submissive and they are subservient. And that is what we need them to be if they're going to help in the ways that you want them to help. And they may be happier than an animal who's being used in some, physically violent way. Yes, true. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for us to say that we value our interests more than their interests, and that we think it's okay to bring these submissive, subservient animals into existence and force them to live. I mean, look, I think my dogs are reasonably happy, but domestication is such a problematic thing, because they are so dependent on us. And you're a veterinarian. I mean, dogs and cats have very neurotic behaviors, all of them. Why do they have very neurotic behaviors? Because they are stuck in a place where they don't belong. And so I don't think, I understand, and I'm not dismissing the value. And my next door neighbor actually does pet therapy. We have interesting discussions. So my next door neighbor does this. But I think that, there's a serious question as to whether or not, if you can't justify domestication, then it doesn't become justifiable, because there are some uses that are more benign than some other uses, and they have some benefit. I just saw it in I can't keep track of these questions. What I said was to Tom Gale Batten, if that's your name. As I prefaced my statement, it's really quite complicated, and I discuss it. I spent quite a few pages talking about it. But the bottom line is, Tom Reagan does say, in situations in which there are particularly what he calls situations of extraordinary situations of conflict, he says we have a moral obligation to prefer humans over non-humans, because humans have greater opportunities for satisfaction. That is a fact. He says that. I could give you the page on which he says it. He also says that he's radically unclear as to how merely sentient animals can be can have inherent value. He doesn't rule it out. He says he's radically unclear as to how that can be the case. Those two things are absolutely true. I can give you the pages if you'd like to look at them. And I said that it's complicated. I discuss it in the book, but I wasn't oversimplifying his position with respect to those two positions. I would like to know in what ways that you think they've been oversimplified.
Next question.
Good evening. Good evening.
Yep. Hi.
I have a question.
Yep.
Hello, Professor. I'm doing my PhD in law at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and my subject is the criminal liability for animals maltreatment. So I've been studying a lot of moral philosophers about the recognition of our obligations towards animals and not about animals, regarding the treatment, the humane treatment, and the recognition of their rights. My question is how this, and in terms of law, how this concept keep up with the anthropocentric character of the law, taking into account that law was made and is made by human for human. How, in terms of law, can we recognize rights towards animals and our obligations towards animals, and not just our obligation about their treatment, about them, and not towards them?
Well, are you the person who asked the question? Vicky sent me a couple questions. You're not the person who asked about self-defense, about the self-defense thing.
No.
Okay, good. Okay.
No, Violeta was Violeta. She's with us. I think.
Who? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Another person, Violeta. She's with
Oh,
us.
okay. I was all right. The answer to your question is, as long as animals are property, they can't have respect-based rights. It's that simple. I mean, as a matter of fact, the first book I wrote in 1995, 1995 was Animals, Property, and the Law. And what I argued in this book was, actually, it was 95 I wrote this. The whole point of that book was to say that animals are property. They can't have rights. They can have interests that are protected by law, but the protection of interest is going to be largely pegged to their use and to issues of efficiency. But they can't have respect-based rights because they're things. And so when you say, well, how are we going to do? How are we going to have rights that are owed to animals? I mean, I think actually, to be honest with you, I think that's what Bentham was trying to do in the early 19th century, was that he was trying to say we can have moral obligations that we owe to animals, because Kant recognized, for example, that we had rights that concerned animals, because he thought, well, I don't have any obligation to animals, but I have an obligation to you. And so I have an obligation to be nice to you. And if I'm cruel to animals, I'm not going to be nice to you. So I have an obligation to be nice to animals, but that's an obligation I owe indirectly to you. So it's not really owed to the animal, it's owed indirectly to you. And so, I think what Bentham was trying to say was, no, that's wrong. We can have obligations that we owe. And I think that that's part of our conventional wisdom. I mean, if you found out that some really nice person, really wonderful person, somebody who was just the sweetest person you knew, was torturing dogs in their basement secretly, but it had no effect on you, and this person was otherwise a wonderful person who just was really kind to everybody, you would still think that person was acting wrongly, because that person was violating obligations that this person owed to the animals themselves. So I think that part of our conventional wisdom is we do think that we have moral obligations that we owe directly to animals, as opposed to moral obligations just concerning animals. However, the law doesn't recognize that we have moral obligations to animals, because they're property, even to the extent that the law seems to say that. It's very similar to what happened with slavery, with race-based slavery. You had laws that looked as though they recognized moral obligations to slaves, but because slaves were property, it didn't really work out that way. And so I think that's the problem. I think that if you're trying to say, well, how are we going to have rights to animals as long as they're property? And the answer is, unless you are thinking about something I haven't thought about, you can't. The answer is it ain't going to happen. You can't have rights, legal rights to animals, not respect-based rights. You can protect interests in a. You can protect interests in a deontological. Well, you're really not going to protect it in a deontological way. You're going to basically protect it consequentially. The most you're going to have is a sort of a rule utilitarianism, but it's going to be largely based on the efficiency of exploitation. This is a complicated issue. I'm more than happy to, somebody can give you my, Evangelos has got my email address, and he can.
I love that if it's
Yeah,
possible.
I'm more than I do a lot of work with graduate students all over the world who do this sort of stuff, and I'm happy to talk with you. It's a little bit of a complicated thing. I would suggest that you get a hold of this and my discussion about respect-based rights, because I think that you might disagree with it, which is fine. We can talk about it, but at least you'll understand more where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, Violetta, would you like to ask your question? Violetta?
Before Violetta asks her question, should I add something to what Gary mentioned about Kant? Probably one of the, in my view at least, one of the sweetest phrases one may find in Kant's texts is concerns these duties concerning animal towards oneself. However, there is a phrase in his lectures in Ethics where Kant claims that being cruel towards animals dries up this part of one's soul, which is necessary for the establishment of morality. Which, in my view, is his way to insist that it's morally unjustifiable to treat animals with cruelty, but he just couldn't find the proper arguments to establish his view, so he makes up this sort of justification, let's say, as a duty towards oneself, or a self-regarding duty.
Yeah.
But let's carry on with Violetta. Where are you, Violetta?
Yeah.
Maybe Panagiotis, you could read Violetta.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't see
Sorry,
you.
I have a problem with my microphone. Mr. Francione, my question refers to defense of a third party in criminal law. In a case when a third party might be an animal. And let me give you an example for, especially for people that are not lawyers here to understand what I am talking about. Let's say while I am walking through the park, I witness someone hitting badly his leashed dog, who cannot run away to help himself. And after my few loud stop it, I am finally obliged to use a reasonable force against the abuser in order to prevent the torment of the poor dog, who thanks to me finally survives. Of course, the abuser will be probably prosecuted for cruelty to animals after my witnessed statement. However, the abuser gets injured, and let's say he sues me for the personal injury. Does penal code in your country accept such a defense when a third party is an animal? Provided, of course, that my response was necessary, proportional to the aggressor's threat, the attack was present, and the animal's life was in real danger, etc. The Greek Penal Code defines the act as justifiable when the actor uses such force to defend himself or another from an unjust and present attack directed against them. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any Greek court rule with the interpretation of the another referring to an animal. You must know in Greece the animals are not persons by law. According to the civil code, they are commodities, property. They are protected, however, by various anti-cruelty laws, as you said, that require humane treatment of them. About the American courts, how do they justify or maybe not such defense of an animal? And what is your opinion on that issue?
Well, I teach criminal law, and the law is the same, that you can use a reasonable amount of force. I mean, there's some complications, but as a general matter, you can use a reasonable proportionate amount of force in defense of another. But another is always another human being, because animals are property, and so they don't count as another. In the example that you gave, if you used reasonable force to protect the animal, even if the person, what would happen? Let's say that you use non-deadly but significant physical force to stop the harm to the animal. The person who was inflicting the harm might get prosecuted for animal cruelty, but you would be prosecuted for battery, or depending on what you'd be prosecuted criminally, and you'd be open to civil liability. You can't see. You can't underestimate that because animals are property, you can't underestimate what that means in terms of how we interpret these rules. So the bottom line is, animals property. You cannot I can use non-deadly force to stop you from stealing my laptop if you come up to me and you try to take my laptop away, and I can use non-deadly force. I can't use deadly force. I can use non-deadly force to stop you from taking my computer. Once you run off with it, I can't use any force. I just have to swear out a complaint against you and then sue you civilly for conversion to get the computer back. But I can't use even non-deadly physical force to retrieve my property in most cases. In some cases, but in most cases, the answer is no. I can use non-deadly physical force or deadly physical force. If I'm walking with my partner and you come up to me, you come up to us, and I reasonably believe you're going to kill my partner, I can use deadly physical force against you. I can use non-deadly force against you if you are threatening non-deadly physical force against my partner, but I cannot use any level of force. Okay, I can't use non-deadly physical force. I may be able to use non-deadly force to stop you from harming the animal, but to the extent that I harm you in defense of the animal, I think you're in very. I mean, I might have an argument that if it were my animal and somebody were trying to hurt my animal, that I could use non-deadly physical force to protect my animal in the same way I use non-deadly physical force to protect my computer. But I doubt that I would be able to engage in any level of significant harm. I've never seen a case in which this came up. It'd be an interesting question. Because most of the time when you're talking about using non-deadly force in defense of property, it's stuff like somebody comes up to you and is trying to take your bag, you got a packet, a bag around your shoulder or something, and someone's trying to grab it because they think you got your wallet in there, you got a computer. And so they're trying to take it and you sort of push the person away. But, do I think you could, in that situation, how much force could you use? I would say that you should be careful about not using anything that could be construed to inflict serious bodily injury on that person. So, pushing somebody away. So if somebody comes up to me and is hitting my dog, can I push the person away? The answer is yes. Yes, sure. But if I had a baseball bat, could I start hitting the person over the head with a baseball bat? I think I might be in serious trouble in a situation like that. So it's an interesting question. I mean, it's an interesting question, but because animals are property, any rule about the use of force is going to be the exact same rule about use of force. They could be used in with respect to any property, including inanimate property. The fact that it's animal property, I don't think changes it and allows you to use greater force. And I certainly don't think you could ever use deadly physical force. Ever. And I think you would probably be well advised that in most, I would imagine most systems would say you shouldn't use non-deadly physical force if it results in if it threatens significant bodily injury. So, I don't know, but it would be the rule, Violetta, would be the same rule that you would apply in any situation of what level of force could you use when property is involved. It would be the same rule. So I suspect in Greece, I don't know, but I mean, I would suspect in Greece that you can use a reasonable amount of force to stop somebody from taking the bag off of your shoulder, and taking your wallet and your computer or whatever the hell you've got in your sack. That you could use non-deadly, reasonable amount of non-deadly physical force. You could push the person away. You could probably hit the person, but could you use deadly physical force against the person? The answer is no. And I would think that anything other than, a push or a punch or something would probably get you into some criminal trouble. It certainly would here. But it's an interesting question. I love the question. It's a great question.
Thank you.
I think Nikos Vlachakis had the question as well. Does Evangelos want to say anything?
Just a quick follow-up to Violetta's question. In general, in Greece and in the European Union, the animals are considered by the law as res mobilis or rara mobilia anyway. This is moving objects. The only exception is when it concerns some gray zones. Let's say when it comes to a blind person's aid or guides a dog, then we have some very interesting cases where the animal was considered as a part of the dead person's body, and the assault was directed towards the blind person, not the dog. Just a follow-up, and I don't know, Gary, if there is some legislation of the kind in the U.S.
That would be a way. If I were representing, there are for criminal battery. If you're an old person and you're walking with a stick, with a cane, or you're disabled, and I kick the cane away while you're holding the cane, that's considered a battery on you because it's considered part of your body. The cane is. So if I were representing somebody, if I would think that you could probably prosecute somebody for battery, even if they didn't touch the actual blind person, but grabbed the dog, that would probably be considered a battery because the dog is a functional extension, but that would only cover that sort of situation. I don't think it would cover most other situations. But it's a really interesting question. If you're working on that for a thesis or whatever, I'd be very interested in looking at it because I really interesting question because I think so the two wrinkles would be that you could use that level of non-deadly physical force that you could use in any property situation, and in some property situations, the animal may be considered to be an extension of the person's body, because I think we would have that here too. I've never seen a situation like that, but I can't say that there's not been such a situation.
Thank you. Let's move on. I think Nikos Vlachakis had a question as well. Is Nikos here? And Georgia Diamantopoulou has also asked for a question. So Georgia, please ask.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Professor, for your insights. So I work in animal welfare for an international animal welfare organization focused on the EU, basically. And at the EU, we're asking for a ban on fur farming, for a ban on wild animals in circuses. This is not disputable. However, for animals used in production, we are engaging in campaigns that essentially aim to abolish, let's say, the use of cages, like the end the cage age, which I'm sure you've heard of. It seems like we have since made amends with the fact that the food industry is just, let's say, too powerful to beat. there are bodies within the EU institutions, platforms, let's say, working groups that we engage with as an animal welfare organization, wherein the industry also participates. The aim of this platform, which is called the EU Platform for Animal Welfare, is to find common welfare grounds that will be considered when drafting legislation in the future. So maybe my question overlaps with the question of Professor Didonis, but for example, should we have been a bit bolder, a bit more radical? Should our approach, let's say, have been more of, that of the abolitionists, let's say?
Yeah,
Would we still be
the answer,
there?
the answer is, yeah, it should have been, but you know what? You would have fewer donations. You might not have a job and you wouldn't be working with industry. Do I think that working with industry and having these organizations is a net benefit? No, I don't. I mean, I don't mean to insult you, but I just don't think, I think look, let's talk about fur for a second. What the hell is the difference? Tell me, please. What is the difference between fur and wool? And I mean, I've never understood the fur campaign. There is no more, I mean, fur is skin with the hair still on it, and leather, is the skin with the hair off of it. And fur, I mean, what's the difference between leather and wool and fur? I think the fur campaign has been an utter disaster. All it is, it's a sexist. It has been. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen. I wrote about this many years ago about the sexist imagery in the anti-fur campaign. It is vile. I mean, it continues to be. It continues when they have these anti-fur demonstrations. They almost always focus on women who are wearing fur and what horrible people those women are. Where condemnations of women are made by people who are wearing wool and who are wearing leather. There is no morally coherent distinction between leather and wool and silk. I remember once seeing a discussion at the supermarket, at the Whole Foods supermarket, which is, I say, attracts a lot of quote animal people. And there was a woman wearing a fur coat and a woman wearing a wool coat. And the woman with the wool coat was arguing with the woman wearing the fur coat, saying she shouldn't be wearing fur. And I watched this for a few minutes, and I walked away, and the one woman wearing the wool said, well, what's your view? I said, what my view is neither of you. You shouldn't be wearing the wool, and she shouldn't be wearing the fur. But the idea that you are reprehending her because she's wearing the fur while you're wearing the wool is somewhat surreal in my view and somewhat absurd. But so I don't understand these anti-fur. I mean, I think that the problem with these campaigns is they draw these artificial distinctions. So you have an anti-fur campaign. What you're doing is telling people leather and wool are fine, just don't wear fur. And I think that to me makes no sense. Secondly, you say, well, in order to work with industry, we have to take these positions. The answer is we're never going to have a revolution working with industry. Number three, I mean, just think about that. Their interests are financial interests. And that the only thing I've been watching this for 3 decades now. I mean, this idea of working with industry originated with a guy named Henry Spira, whom I knew very well. He's now dead. And Henry introduced this idea, which Peter Singer thought was a great idea, that what we needed to do is work with industry. And I think that is fundamentally misguided. I don't think that can ever work. Number 3, you said the food industry is too powerful. I don't accept that. The reality is we're all sitting talking. I mean, I'm not in Athens right now because I can't travel. Because although, this is ecologically, it's better not to fly. So I don't object to this. But the bottom line is we are all dealing with this damn pandemic. Why? Pandemics are zoonotic. They are illnesses which jump from animals to humans. Okay. And they generally do that in the context of our relationship with animals, which involves eating them. So, our continued eating animals is a complete, utter disaster because you know what? We may get this pandemic under control, although that remains to be seen because there are variations now, and it's not clear whether the vaccine hits all those variations. But let's assume, for argument purposes, that we do get this under control. It's just a matter of time till the next pandemic comes along, and there will be another pandemic. But if you think about it, all these pandemics come from animals. So if we want to continue having these bizarre situations where we all sit in our houses and talk to each other on screens, well, then just, let's just keep eating animals. If we want to deal with global, I have a couple friends at Oxford, and they're doing terrific work at Oxford on animal consumption and global warming. And the reality is, being vegan is the best thing that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. And it is also the case that if we don't reduce our intake of animal products by 75 to 95%, at least 75 to 95%, which means that because everyone's not going to go completely vegan, we need to have more vegans to make up for the people who aren't going to go 75 to 95%. But the bottom line is we're going to be unable to avert climate catastrophe. Marco Springman's been doing this work at Oxford. It's terrific work. And so, the reality is you can say, well, the food industry is too powerful. I don't accept that. Yes, they are powerful. They're very powerful. They're very powerful. But the reality is we could bring about a change if all of us who cared about animals said, no, we're not participating in this anymore. If we built a vegan movement, we could change the world. We just decide not to do it because we think it's too hard. So what do? We end up working with industry. And you know what? I've been watching that happen since the 1990s. And you know what? It has resulted in nothing except people feeling more comfortable about animal exploitation and people believing that there's that fur is somehow worse than wool or leather. All of this, we need to change the mindset, but we can change the mindset. We just have to get away from the corporatization because, we are all creatures of corporations form what we think. And we have a tendency to think that nonprofit organizations are somehow different and they're not forming our reality. And the answer is no, that's wrong. They may be not-for-profit corporations, but they are corporations and they are in business. What's the name of you don't have to say, but whatever your organization is. Your organization is a business. They have to make money to hire you and the other people that work for that organization. And the only way that works is to keep the thing very broad and not alienate people. Okay, so you basically you never tell people that they need to be vegan in order to fully respect the moral value of animals. They need to be vegan. They're not going to say that because most of the people who work for these organizations aren't vegan. I mean, I forget the name of the guy who was the head of, you probably know, the International Fund for Animal Welfare. What's his name? Mike, do you know who I'm talking about? IFAW, you're familiar with IFAW. I forget the guy's name, but over the years, I've had exchanges with them about, this idea that they're not even vegan. And so what we're talking about having an animal organization where the people who run the animal organization aren't vegan. What sense does this make? And so I think this is counterproductive. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not insulting you, but I have to be honest. I think it's counterproductive. I think it's harmful. And the guy's name is driving me crazy. And this gets worse as you get older. You forget people's names. But I've written about this guy and I forgot his name. But if you're you're running an animal organization, you're not vegan. What are we talking about? And so, I can't, the chat keeps showing up and then it disappears. I can't do both things. So I'm sorry if there's stuff going on in the chat. I can't.
Okay. Let's take a last question since it's here 9:30. There, I suppose 2:30 in New York. You know, Professor Francione, we used to know New York because of Roth's novels. Now we know it because of you as well. Philip Roth.
Sorry, what?
Philip Roth was from New York.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Now we
Yes,
have a
right.
second good reason to know New York here in Greece. So one last question. Who would like to ask one last question? We have no more questions. Anyone?
Hello. Hi. Unfortunately, I'm not in a video conference, but could I ask a question?
Sure.
Dear Professor, I get the sense throughout this conversation that sentience as a notion is an umbrella concept that everybody including biologists, bioethicists, the industry, vets, vegans, everybody, us included, use it ad hoc and in a contextualized base whenever we need it. You use it in another framework. Singer and Regan use it in other frameworks, as I've seen from the chat. How can we end up in a unanimous solution to base our decisions on sentience, if it's not a common, let's say, translation of the word? Thank
Well,
you.
we may not know what the outer, I mean, first of all, it's generally agreed that subjective is sentience means you're subjectively aware, that you have, you're the sort of being that has interest. You're the sort of being who is subjectively aware, can experience pleasure, experience pain, things like that. Now, we may not know. There may be questions about what the outer limits of sentience are as to whether or not certain animals are sentient. For example, there may be certain mollusks or whatever. I mean, clams and oysters, are they sentient? I don't know. I don't eat them. They may be sentient. I don't know. There's some people who think they are and some people who think they aren't. But I don't eat them because I don't know whether insects are sentient, but I don't walk on grass and I try to always avoid stepping on insects. I don't know whether they're sentient. But the bottom line is there is no doubt whatsoever that with respect to the animals we routinely exploit, chickens, pigs, sheep, cows, calves, geese, turkeys, fish, that they are sentient. There's no doubt about that. So I may not know where to draw the line, but there's no doubt that all of those animals are sentient. And all that means is they have some sort of mind that has interest, because you need to have interest in order to be, I mean, if a being doesn't have interest, then there's nothing that you can do that adversely affects that being, because the being doesn't have any interest. But that we are absolutely certain, without doubt, there is no doubt whatsoever that 99.99999% of the animals we routinely exploit are sentient. We don't doubt that. We've had anti-cruelty laws, for several hundred years now. Nobody thinks that we should apply them to rocks or plants. And the only time you get in discussions with people about plants is when they have nothing else to say in a discussion about why they shouldn't be eating animals, is they start talking about whether lettuce leaves are sentient. But we don't know. And even if plants are sentient, since it takes between 6 and 12, or actually it takes many more pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh, even if plants were sentient, we'd still be better off eating the plants directly rather than eating them funneled through the inefficient protein converters of animals, of sentient animals. But so I don't think the problem, I don't see, look, I don't see sentience as presenting or on lack of clarity about what sentience means in any way as presenting any sort of conceptual problem, because my view is that I don't know where to draw the line, but I do know that most of the animals we routinely exploit are sentient, and nobody seriously doubts that. There may be some animals, as I say, there may be some animals where there are disagreements, where people say, well, I'm a vegan, but I eat clams because I really don't believe that they're sentient. As I say, I err in favor of not eating them because they may be sentient. But I don't know. I'll take one more. If there's any other question, I'll take one more.
Any other questions, since Professor Francione is eager to answer one more? We'll have him here.
Hello, Professor. Can I make a question? Thank you. Those who have cats and dogs and are vegan don't want their animals to eat meat from other animals. There are many of them. And I ask you if this is right, because these animals are basically carnivores. What do you feed your animals, your dogs?
Great question.
Could you the rest of you close your microphones, because there's something like some disturbance of the voice.
Thank you. That's a great question. Our dogs are all vegans, and have been for decades now. There is no problem with having dogs be vegan, because they're not they're omnivores. They're like us. They're omnivores. They can get nutrition from multiple sources. So it's easy it's easy for dogs to be vegan. And now with cats, it's a little more complicated. Although I don't live with cats. When you have 5 dogs, if you have a cat in the house, you have chaos. You have lots of chaos. And we don't live with cats. But I have lots of friends, including one of my really close friends is a vet, and her cats are all vegans. Now she monitors their pH, or she monitors them to make sure, because some cats will develop crystals in their urethras, but some cats will develop crystals in their urethras even if they're vegan. So I mean, some cats just develop crystals, but you have to be careful with cats. But also let me say this: cats need the taurine, but you can get vegan taurine, which you can add to food, because in much of the canned food, particularly the cheaper canned food, they add supplemental taurine anyway, because the taurine has been processed out of the food. So they're adding supplemental taurine. You can buy the taurine, the vegan taurine, and you can add it to the food. The interesting question, which I get from time to time, is what do you do in a situation where you try to get the cat to be vegan, and the cat, it's jeopardizing the cat's health? Now, there are some animal people who say, well, you should just kill the cat. Now, I don't agree with that. My view is that we've been domesticating animals. It's our fault. Animals are here because of our lack of moral, because of us, they're in this mess. We cannot, animals make all sorts of moral messes that we can't clear up. And so what I distinguish between justification and excuse. If I had a cat and the cat needed to eat meat in order to live, would it be morally justifiable for me to feed that cat meat? And the answer is no, it wouldn't be morally justifiable, but it would be excusable if I had exhausted every possible option, but I was unable to get the cat to be healthy as a vegan. It would be excusable, i.e., it's morally wrong, but the wrongness is mitigated, that my culpability is mitigated by the compulsion of the situation. To draw a distinction in a human context, if you and I are on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean, we're starving. I kill you and I eat you. This sort of thing has actually happened. I kill you and I eat you. It's still murder. It's not morally justifiable what I've done. But one could argue, and indeed it has been argued, that even though that's not morally justifiable, it's morally excusable. It's wrong. But the wrongness of it is mitigated by the culpability, the blameworthiness is mitigated by the compulsion in the situation. And I discussed that in my new book. I've discussed it in other places as well. But I think, look, we're in a moral mess. So if somebody's taking care of a cat, I think it's crazy to tell them you got to kill the cat. I mean, we can't clean these problems up in a tidy way. So I don't think it's morally justifiable, in the same way that it wouldn't be morally justifiable if I killed you and I ate you. That wouldn't be morally right. It would be morally wrong. But another context in which we use this is in the context in criminal law, the context of duress. Let's assume you and I are walking down the street and somebody walks up to me. You come up, I'm walking with my child down the street. You come up to me and you have a gun. You put a gun to my child's head and you say to me, if you don't go in there and rob that store and give me the money, I'm going to kill your child. And I say, okay, I'll go in and rob the store. And I go in and I rob the store. What I did was wrong, because the store owner didn't do anything wrong. I mean, I've done something wrong with respect to the store owner, but I've done it in order to stop you from killing my child. So although what I did was not justifiable, it was excusable because of the compulsion inherent in the situation. And I think that sort of thinking can help us puzzle through the situation of cats. I think, as I say, I have lots of friends who have healthy vegan cats. I've never had a health problem with my dogs with their vegan diet. Never had a problem at all. And so anyway, well, listen, it has been really great being with you. And I really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you so much,
Yeah.
so much for this thought-provoking discussion.
Yeah. Now I realize, and I look, I want
Thank you so much, guy.
Yeah, Evangelist, thank you. Thank you for including me. And I'll come back whenever you want me to come back. But think about being vegan. You know, if you think animals matter, we cannot continue. You might be able to justify, or not justify, but you may be excused if you're stuck on a desert island and you're either going to starve to death if you don't eat the rabbit. It may be excusable in the same way that it may be excusable if you're on the desert island, you might eat your sister. You might kill and eat your sister because that's the only way you're going to continue to live. But we don't live on desert islands. You know, you live in Greece. I live in the state. You know, we all have easy access to plant foods. And, you know, I mean, Greece has got wonderful vegetable foods. So when you choose to eat animals, what you're doing is you're making a moral choice to participate in the exploitation of these animals. So just think about it. If animals matter, if they matter morally, we cannot justify continuing to use them in the way that we use them. So I ask you all to think, those of you who care about animals, who think animals matter morally, who reject the idea that animals are things, I ask you to think seriously about becoming vegan. And if you have any questions, get my email from Evangelos and make sure you put in the subject line, because I get 3 zillion emails every single day. But just put in the subject line, you know, from Greek class or something which will indicate that you're from here. You know, you're from this class, and then I'll try to respond to you. But be patient with me because I get flooded with stuff. It's crazy. But anyway, so y'all be well. Peace. Take care, and I hope you all go vegan. But I hope you're all well. All right, take care. Be well.
Gary, you'll have the opportunity to convince more people to go vegan. In the case you agree to participate in a discussion with Professor Dudonis and maybe me, that will be published in Conatus. You'll get an official invitation, of course, concerning this.
Yeah, sure. Let's debate it, man. Let's debate it. Right? Let's debate it.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Peace. Bye. Be well, everybody. Bye.
Take care. Stay safe. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.